So welcome to the 797th monthly meeting of Eastern Pennsylvania branch of EPAASM. You may know me, my name is Vincent Tam. You may know me from all the Zoom meetings that we've had for the last 2 years. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the branch for really supporting us through the pandemic. And as we emerge from this pandemic, I implore everyone to continue your support and try to come out to the meeting personally. I know it's a burden, but we need to revive this community and establish this, microbiologist and immunologist society that we can all network together and connect. And this is our first in-person meeting since the pandemic, but this is also a bittersweet moment. We're here to celebrate the life and career of one of our most esteemed colleagues, Dr. James Poupard, who passed away in last May. And I don't claim to know him more than any of you because I'm a relatively newcomer, but all the interactions I've had with him, it was fantastic. He's always had a great sense of humor, a wonderful smile, and I'm always in awe of his deep knowledge of the history of branch and microbiology. And we're grateful that his family is here today to join us in person. And he is and will be greatly missed. And his impact you see on the community, on a branch, and on microbiology itself. So a quick housekeeping. ASM, like NPR, we need membership support. So does our branch. We have monthly meetings, we have our I&I meeting, clinical symposium, and education programs. So, and as you know, by now, the Zoom meetings, if you have questions, use the participant tab, raise the blue hand, or you can put it in chat. For audience here, I think how it goes is you raise your physical hand, and then you can ask your questions. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Linda Miller. She is, first and foremost, a clinical microbiologist. She's the head of CMID Pharma Consulting LLC. Her expertise is in antibacterial drug discovery and diagnostics for infectious disease. She was a student, mentee, a friend, and a colleague of Jim's. She received a PhD from Penn. She also served our bench tirelessly. She was the president 93 to 95. She was the chair of Division A of ASM, that's antimicrobial agents. She's been the chair of the clinical symposium, and which she's been an active member since. She's a member of the education committee and our archive. And we just want to express our gratitude for Linda because she's the main driving force of this memorial lecture. Without her, things wouldn't come together as nicely. And there's no person better to start off this program than Linda. So without further ado.
Thank you so much, Vincent, and welcome to all of you who are here. It's really amazing to see these familiar faces, and I know Jim is with us. And also welcome to those of you who joined us by Zoom. Special thanks to Barbara Poupard, Jim's wife, and his children, James, Nanette, Jackie, and granddaughter Emily, who are all with us here tonight, and the rest of the family joining by Zoom. And as Vincent said, we're all here to commemorate an amazing person, special individual, Jim Poupard, Dr. James A. Poupard. Jim was a mentor, a colleague, and a friend to me and to many others who are here tonight and looking at their faces right now. And it's an honor to tell you a little bit about this very special individual. I didn't figure out how to do this, do I? Okay, that wasn't good. Which way does the? Should I use this or use the mouse? Oh, the mouse. to the other. Okay, so I'm going to start talking because of just short amount of time while this is coming up. The first thing I'm going to talk about is Jim's education, which he used to talk about how it took him 34 years to get his PhD. And literally, okay, great. So 34 years to get his PhD, and all of his education was in Philadelphia. So I was very excited when I saw this map. It's a little bit older than the time period when Jim did all of his work, but I love this map, and Jim also loved maps, right? That was a big thing for him. And I did think that we could put circles all over this map of all the places that he went, had his education, and also all the places that he worked, and that he just had a special passion for Philadelphia. And before I go through all these different centers of learning, I will say Jim gave the best tours of Philadelphia that you could ever have. And back in 2009, we had a general ASM meeting, and Jim, leading the group, of course, put together this really cool map of fun microbiology places to see in Philadelphia. And I think they handed out next to the Liberty Bell. So Jim's career, and I'm going to keep moving because we have not that much time to go over an amazing career, but he went to Roman Catholic High School. He went to Franklin School of Science and Arts, where he met the wonderful Barbara Dem. He went to University of Pennsylvania for undergraduate courses while he was working. I mean, his whole career, he was constantly working, going to school, working part-time jobs, raising a family, thanks to Barbara, of course. But he got his BA from Temple University, and he got his, he got his master's degree in clinical microbiology at Thomas Jefferson University in the first class that there was for a master's in clinical microbiology. And it was Dr. Eileen Randall who started that program. So he was in that first class. He started his PhD at Bryn Mawr College, working under Dr. Jane Oppenheimer in the history of science, but there was a collaboration between Bryn Mawr College and University of Pennsylvania, and Jim decided to move into a new interdisciplinary program at Penn that really met his needs, and he did his PhD under Dr. Rita Rose and finished that in 1982, so 34 years of education. So when I tried to think of words to describe Jim's career and fields of study, they were words like interdisciplinary, eclectic, and curious. Jim was so curious. He worked in Wyeth Laboratories' very first job in clinical chemistry. Then he went to Wistar, and he worked on the Kaprowski polio vaccine. And if you read the book Vaccine Wars by Meredith Wadman, who was one of our speakers, there's a nice little section in there on some of the work that he did. He then went to Smith, Kline & French. He worked in virology, tissue culture. He talked about how he loved tissue culture, that he just was one with tissue culture. He also was a poultry clerk, which is fascinating, and I won't go into, I don't really know too many of those details, but I thought it was worth adding in for that eclectic interdisciplinary. He worked at National Drug Company, and he also then became supervisor in clinical microbiology laboratory under Dr. Harry Morton. I believe that was after he finished his bachelor's degree, so he was continuing to go back to school. In addition to being the supervisor, he was the head of the antimicrobial testing laboratory, and he brought in doing Bauer-Kirby disc diffusion. And I will point out that anybody who says Kirby-Bauer is wrong. It is Bauer-Kirby, and Jim would always point that out, and he was correct, and you should change if you say it the wrong way. His research, he also did research at the same time. So he's the head of 2 departments, plus he's working on bifidobacterium research with Dr. Robert Norris. At the same time, he's taking on part-time jobs, not to mention the family growing in size. And he worked at Einstein North, Temple University, and this amazed me, chemistry lab night shift. That sounds like a nightmare to me. He also, that wasn't enough, he also had a new obsession. So if you go to the Museum of Natural History in Philadelphia, there is a statue of Joseph Leidy, and Jim and Tom Thompson, and I know Barbara was very involved in this as well, wrote the, put together the Joseph Leidy letters, which was a comprehensive index and summary of Joseph Leidy. That's like a tremendous resource for people trying to do research on this important person. Jim's first paper, very first paper, was on antibiotic susceptibility. So I thought when I was putting this together, wow, that's really cool, because our speaker tonight, Dr. Pettengill, is going to be talking about susceptibility, so very relevant. He also did some very important work in bifidobacterium. So back to this interdisciplinary, eclectic, and curious, right? So now done. He's moving on from his early work to, he finished his degree, his master's degree, and came to the Bryn Mawr Hospital. And that is where I met Jim. And there are a number of people I'm looking at in the audience who were also on Zoom who met Jim at Bryn Mawr Hospital. And this period of time started, well, he was probably involved also at Penn as well, but he had so many students, hundreds and hundreds of students, no exaggeration. He left Bryn Mawr and went to the Medical College of Pennsylvania, where he was also director of clinical microbiology. He had 3 appointments in teaching, and he in 3 different departments. And he was also director of the graduate program in clinical microbiology. I see people cheering in the audience at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. Again, many students, graduate students, PhD students, medical students. They were a huge part of his life. He left and went back to SmithKline Beecham in 1990, which it was SmithKline in French when he worked there before. Now it was SmithKline Beecham, and became GSK, where he headed up a global clinical microbiology group. Other people in the audience I see from that. And it was really a global, not only it included discovery and antibiotic drug development. And then when he left there, he created a consortium of consulting groups called the Pharma Institute of Philadelphia. And in typical Jim fashion, it would have to have a funny little name. So it was PIP. So he always said, PIP is doing this and PIP is doing that. So that was kind of his next phase. Jim was also, speaking of susceptibility testing, instrumental in some key things that happened in the field of susceptibility testing. Certainly at GSK, a very important project was new susceptibility breakpoints for the drugs. And one of the important drugs was Augmentin. And Jim and the team and I also worked at GSK, had a focus on pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, which was kind of applying a relatively new at that time to setting the cutoffs for susceptibility and resistance. Jim was an advisor for many years to the CLSI, which is the international body that sets breakpoints and testing guidelines. And he was very important, played a very important role in setting a global international standard for susceptibility testing, so that everyone in the world is doing the same method, the same temperature, the same media, the same incubation periods, and that was really a big important step forward. I can't possibly go into all of the research because I'm sure that I'm running out of time, but he had this wide area of research, and including things I've already said before, but also penicillin resistance, history of science research, history of science papers such as smallpox as biological weapon in the French and Indian War, lactobacillus, tuberculosis. He did some work in retroviruses and neuromyelopathies. I think one of the interesting studies that he was involved with, and again, his interdisciplinary nature and ability to work with people, methods for data mining from a large national surveillance studies. So a lot of really interesting work across the span of microbiology. For our branch, Jim was, he encouraged medtech students to come to ASM meetings when they were students and then after. And he encouraged us to get on committees, like right out of school and just be involved. And he was passionate about that. He became a member of National ASM in 1971, and he was the branch president from 1987 to 1989. I'm not going to say anything about the work he did at ASM National. We have Ann Dempsey here representing ASM National, and Dr. Toby Eisenstein is going to speak to Jim's work for ASM National next. But I will say that Jim, for our local branch, he was the chair of our archives committee. And he also pretty much wrote everything that is in our archive section of the website. And I really encourage you to look at it. There's so many great stories in there. He wrote a beautiful essay about our first female branch president back in November this past year. And he also spoke at our 50th symposium. So one of the things that allowed Jim to put together kind of three of his passions was he loved history. He loved history, he loved microbiology, and he loved Philadelphia. So he wrote this wonderful book, A History of Microbiology in Philadelphia. And it's about how bacteriology became an identifiable discipline of science. And it's really a beautiful book. I brought a copy with me. And focuses on the people and institutions that played a big role in bacteriology in Philadelphia, and in particular, the role of our branch in that area and how our branch really was influential. So this is my final slide, and I just want to say that if you ever took a walk in Philadelphia, or really anywhere, with Jim and Barbara, and you would see like a little weed or wildflower, they always called them wildflowers, Jim would go crazy. He would be like, whoa, this is so great, look, there's life is coming out of the crack in the earth. And it was really fun. My daughter says there's nothing like a tour of Philadelphia with anybody but Jim. Jim made you look inside yourself, and he challenged you to think deeply. And he really did challenge you. It wasn't all just, he would challenge you. He also would say, when considering a problem in bacteriology, to think like a bacterium. And his students, we would try to do that, think like a bacterium. When Jim passed away in May of this year, I thought that there was a big gaping hole in the world. But when I think about Jim's wonderful family and the scores of students and friends and colleagues that he inspired, I know that his passion for microbiology and his love of life lives on in all of us. So, thank you. Thank you. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Toby Eisenstein. Dr. Eisenstein is currently the professor of microbiology and immunology at the Lewis Katz School of Medicine at Temple University. She's the acting chair of the department. She was the acting chair of the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Temple Medical School. She's also a very active member of her branch. She was secretary of our branch, and she also served as the branch president in 1983 to 1985. Importantly, Toby is here representing ASM National along with Ann Dempsey. Toby was a member of the Council of National ASM. She was chair of the branch organization committee of ASM, and she was the chair of the membership board of the National ASM for three 2-year terms. And that board had 8 committees: membership, archives, branch organization committee, student chapter, branch lectureship, underrepresented members committee, career development, and grants for women. So really pleased to have Toby here today to talk about Jim's role at ASM National and at the Center for the History of Microbiology. Thank you.
No, not end meeting. No, cancel. I want to end the slide. Oh, it was on the left side. License time.
Linda, that was such a fabulous speech. It's a hard one to follow. But I hope to give you some additional information about Jim's passion for history, microbiology, and what he accomplished at the national level, which was something that only someone with his personality, perseverance, and ability could have done. As you heard, he was a clinical microbiologist, but he also received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in the history of science, as Linda told you. And that became really his passion in addition to his day jobs as a clinical microbiologist. He took it upon himself to educate other microbiologists and the world about the history of our science. So one of the first things that he did at National was to become chair of the Archives Committee at National ASM. And at that time, it was a very sleepy committee and not much was happening. When he took the reins, he decided to organize at the national meeting, which at that time used to get 15,000 people. It was really a big meeting. It was called the General Meeting. And he organized the first History of Microbiology lecture at the national meeting. He then grew from a very tiny collection of archives that was mainly at National ASM headquarters, and archives that is now housed at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. But he is the one who made that transition and made it possible. He organized a conference there on biological defense research, and that's where the National Archives were, but this gave the National Archives some visibility. He had the idea to try to bring the history more to the members, and he was the first one who organized an exhibit at the National ASM meeting on the history of microbiology. And I still remember this one on the Walter Reed Army Institute for Research that he did in 1993, where it was the history of yellow fever. And he had a bunch of cases with books and artifacts, and it was absolutely fascinating. He wanted to make the archives something larger. And he was instrumental in convincing the National ASM, first of all, to hire a professional archivist. And the person who's been in that job since he was hired by Jim is Jeff Carr. And I think Jeff is on our Zoom meeting. And he's the one who worked so closely with Jim to make this a reality. For a little while, Jim left the chair of the Archives Committee. There's a little bit of politics in there. But in 2007, when I became chair of the membership board and the Archives Committee was under the membership board, as Linda was telling you, it's a crazy name. They called the board the membership board, but it had these 8 committees under it, only one of which was the membership committee. It was the branches, the student committee, and the archives was also part of the membership board. So Jim came back on the archives committee, partly at my urging, because I knew from the branch how fantastic he was. And what I could see was nobody at National was actually doing very much. It took a while until the person who was chair decided that she didn't want to do it anymore. And I convinced Jim to reassume the chairmanship of the archives committee. And I am so glad that he agreed to do that. In that position, there was a meeting in Philadelphia. The national meeting was in Philadelphia, and Jim gave a great talk on the history of microbiology in Philadelphia at that national meeting. And he used that as the nidus to produce this beautiful history of microbiology. And it's such an amazing volume that it deserves being on two different slides, Linda's slide and my slide. It just details every meeting we ever had and every person that was ever an officer or was active in the branch. His next landmark was really something for which he had vision. And that was, he wanted to make the archives something larger than just a collection of things. And he wanted to call it the Center for the History of Microbiology / Archives, because everybody at National was always calling it the archives. He called it CHOMA. And he worked so hard to do this. One of the first things that he did when he, as chair, was to work with Jeff Carr and compile or expand this bibliography of microbiology related publications in America from 1721 to 1950. And they updated this bibliography and they purchased items to fill out the print collections of these publications. So the archives actually have physical books, articles, journals, and objects from certain famous people's laboratories. And they published a paper, Poupard and Carr, the earliest American books on general microbiology. And as chair from 2011 to 2016, Jim organized History of Microbiology lectures at the yearly general meeting. He was very interested in biological warfare, and he established a biological warfare collection of publications, personal papers of people that were involved in biological warfare and pertaining to the international aspects of that part of microbiology. There had also been a very sporadic program at National to designate certain sites in the United States as milestone sites for the history of microbiology. And the organization of what would be chosen and where it would be was quite haphazard and actually sort of political. You know, somebody said, well, I want to have one in my city. So Jim made the people at National agree to put these milestone choices as an activity of the Center for the History of Microbiology / Archives Committee. And they formalized the process by how a milestone spot would be chosen. People had to apply. They had to write a letter explaining why they thought their site was worthy of this honor. And that formalization was very important because they put together over the years at least a dozen or more of these milestone sites. Jim also proposed to each branch at the branch organization committee meetings that were held at National that each branch, besides the Eastern Pennsylvania branch, should engage in a branch history. And he asked the branches to submit their branch histories to the Center for the History of Microbiology. Well, of course, nobody did what he did, make a book, but you know, people wrote like 3 pages of their history. But it did get branches to, you know, think about the fact that they had some historical roots. Jim also got the National Program Committee. And again, these things are so political. You know, like the program committee is, well, we don't have space, we don't have time. But he just worked at people and he said, you know, we need to have a session where people can put up posters for the history of microbiology. And he got it through. This was at the general ASM meeting. And he also began a collection of curriculum vitae of distinguished members of ASM. And he convinced National to fund a travel award for one, and now I think it's two people, to visit the ASM archives to carry out research in the area of the history of microbiology. I want to say that all these details that have been put together with the years, I was able to put together because Ann Dempsey, who is the head staff person of membership, the membership services at ASM, and under whom the volunteers that were in all these committees, including me and the archives, worked. We worked for the membership committee. And Jeff Carr, who was the archivist, I asked them if they could give me a little more information, and they sent me 4 pages single-spaced of everything that Jim did. So what you're seeing on the slides, I definitely owe to them. So I do want to say a few personal words about Jim. I would summarize Jim's contribution to ASM with 3 words: vision, dedication, and passion. And Linda mentioned passion. Jim lived and breathed history as the bedrock of a scientific field and a scientific organization. It was through his personal vision that we have a Center for the History of Microbiology, with an actual collection of books, journals, and artifacts that attest to that history, and a staff archivist to administer the collection. He had the dedication to convince the board of the National ASM to fund these endeavors. That was the important point. You know, nobody cared what he did as long as he found the money. He found money for some of them, like the lectures, but he managed to convince ASM to put a line in the budget for an archivist's salary, which was, you know, the big step forward. And he also convinced them to lend their support to a lecture each year at the national meeting on the history of microbiology, which involved convincing the program committee to set an hour aside. And there was a great deal of politics that went into trying to even get an hour. You wouldn't believe that, but it was. He was the first to organize exhibits at the national meeting on the history of microbiology, and to organize with great pride the milestones of microbiology. So I'm recapping the great things that he did. So we are so lucky that he was a member of our Eastern Pennsylvania branch, and that we benefited from his incredible work ethic in organizing our history. ASM and the world's microbiology community are the beneficiaries of his initiatives at the National ASM. Jim, you were a magnificent colleague and a shining example of what one person can do if they have vision and the dedication and passion to make their dreams a reality.
Thank you so much, Toby. That was beautiful. Great summary and beautiful words. Our next speaker is Dr. Matthew Pettengill. Dr. Pettengill is an assistant professor and the director of clinical microbiology at Thomas Jefferson University and Medical Center. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where Jim received and was very excited to receive his master's degree in clinical microbiology. Dr. Pettengill received his PhD in quantitative and systems biology, cellular microbiology at the University of California. He has fellowships from medical and public health microbiology at the University of Rochester, postdoctoral fellowship in infectious diseases at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. He's a diplomat of the American Board of Medical Microbiology. He has a wide range of publications, and he is going to speak to us today about susceptibility testing, and I don't have your talk right in front of me. And I'm going to let you pull it up. So we really look forward to that. And thank you so much for being our keynote speaker.
Thank you, Linda. Before I get started in the talk, I'll tell you that I heard a news story about Jim helping somebody that he didn't even know last week. And also hearing that he worked the third shift in the chemistry lab. There's only two reasons you do that. You're desperate for the cash, or you're passionate about helping people in lab medicine. I assume he was the latter group. But we actually hired a technologist on our second shift that started about a month ago. And she saw the flyer for this meeting and said that she actually knew about Dr. Poupard. I was like, oh, how'd you know about it? Because she had moved from Brazil just like a year and a half ago. And she said she was working in a clinical lab in Brazil, and she had wanted to come to the States to get a PhD in microbiology. She had contacted everybody, and she had like an M100 CLSI, and it had all these people's names in it. So everybody that was in the US, she contacted them. And the only one that got back to her was Jim. And she had corresponded with him over the course of a couple of years, and he had tried to help her get into a program over here. And it didn't work out for family reasons for her to come at that time. But she said that she really had appreciated her interactions with him, and that he was genuinely trying to help her out. And that, obviously had never met her, didn't know her. She's working in our second shift in micro right now. So I wanted to give a talk. I know we have kind of a varied group, a lot of basic scientists, clinical scientists. But so how do we know how to treat an infection? So I'm going to give some examples and spend a little bit more time on the areas that the clinical lab can contribute to. And Jim did a lot of work in the area of susceptibility testing in his research publications. So kind of three groups. So empiric treatment based on a syndrome or a clinical diagnosis. Empiric treatment based on organism identified, but you don't have susceptibility testing results available yet, or targeted treatment based on the actual lab susceptibility testing results. So I'll give some examples of each. So for example, Lyme disease, which I'm sure everyone here has heard about. One thing you may not know is that actually Pennsylvania has the most reported cases of Lyme disease of any state in the United States. Not the highest rate per capita, but based on the number population here and the rate that we have, it is the highest number. So Lyme disease can be a clinical diagnosis at the clinic. So a patient shows up, has erythema migrans. If they present at kind of the appropriate time, physician can evaluate for that, and they don't need any diagnostic testing after that. That's compelling enough that they have Lyme disease. They can treat based on that. They can also, if they show up at a later time in the course, can submit samples to the laboratory for serologic diagnosis of Lyme disease. This was a patient from a week or two ago that came through our lab that had positive Lyme serologic testing. We've switched to modified two-tier testing for those that are interested in that kind of thing. So they can, based on the lab diagnosis or the clinical diagnosis, choose to treat. But then how do you treat? So the Infectious Disease Society of America and other bodies produce guidelines that's based on clinical trial data and also in some cases on clinical experience, produce these guidelines that physicians can refer to for what the recommended treatment course is. In this case, if a patient shows up with erythema migrans, they have a very clear recommendation to treat with oral doxycycline or an oral beta-lactam. However, if it's a slightly different scenario and there is CNS involvement, they recommend IV antibiotics, ceftriaxone, other beta-lactams, also oral doxycycline as an example. So you can, just based off of a clinical diagnosis and guidelines, make a treatment course decision without lab data as to the susceptibility results of the individual organism. In this case, Lyme disease, the Borrelia burgdorferi bacteria that causes it, is not easy to culture. There's not any susceptibility testing of the individual isolates to guide this. So it's just based on empiric evidence. You can also have cases where you've identified an organism, but you don't have susceptibility testing results available yet for that specific isolate. And so you can base the treatment decision on the identification and a local antibiogram. Particularly that's in a hospital. Now, a lot of primary care physicians are still going to refer to guidelines for the treatment early on, but at a hospital, we have an antibiogram. I'm going to spend some time talking about that. What is an antibiogram? So an antibiogram is recent and local institution-specific data on the susceptibility profile for organisms seen at that institution, because they can vary from institution to institution, from region to region, what the expected antimicrobial resistance profile would be. This is an example from ours from last year, so it looks a little busy, but a lot of the physicians we actually still print these cards, so they'll have it in their coat pocket. If they've got an E. coli, they can flip it out and say, okay, well, what percentage of E. coli is susceptible to ceftriaxone? And so we tabulate this data every year, and there are recommendations for how to tabulate it. First organism per patient per time period, 1 year or 2 years, depending on how you keep track of your antibiograms. They also have recommendations, and this is in a CLSI document as well, CLSI M39, other guidelines for how you provide a cumulative antibiogram. One area of that I'm going to talk a little bit about, because we had a couple of medical student and another undergrad that spent some time researching on this in our lab, or doing some simulations and modeling, is the number of isolates needed to include. So the recommendation from CLSI is to not put it in your antibiogram if you don't have at least 30 isolates, just because it's statistically sort of unreliable. And we wanted to probe that because I've noticed over time, I'm interested in looking at everybody's antibiograms, probably most lab directors are, that it's quite common to use less than 30 isolates. I'll give you some examples of that. So this is from an academic medical center in California. And you can see their 2014 antibiogram had Candida tropicalis, only 8 isolates, and it's showing 100% susceptibility for itraconazole and voriconazole. However, if you look down just a few years, 2020, they've got voriconazole for the same organism at only 40% susceptibility. So what is it, 100 or 40? Was there an actual biological change in the organism, or is it a low number of isolates and we're just looking at random noise is what they're observing? It may be some combination of both. But we wanted to sort of probe that. I'll give some further examples, which will kind of drive home the point that it's fairly common to use less than 30, and that it shouldn't be a common practice. So in this example, which is actually from one of the labs within our Jefferson system from a few years ago, this is for one of their ICU units specifically. So you can see they have coag negative staff with only 3 isolates reported in the antibiogram. And they're saying 0% susceptible to oxacillin. No way that's true. Maybe it was true for those 3, but it's just such a small sample size. It probably should have been around 50%. And they also had 5 isolates of Enterococcus faecium at 0% susceptible to vancomycin. It is low, but depending on the institution, more like 20 to 40%. Another busy example, but I'll highlight the things in question. One of the things in question for the clinical lab folks is why they were reporting some of these things like augmentin for staff. But also you can notice that they had over a single year changes in the 15 to 20% range. Probably not true that that's a real change in the resistance rate in the organisms at that institution. This is probably sampling bias. And so we did a quick research study. So we had a medical student that wanted to work on a project that he could do at home. So this is something with OCAS. He can just work on this in his computer. So we took all of our real lab data, over three years of data. And you can see the different organism and drug combinations that we evaluated. And so what we had him do is take a larger sample size, anywhere from a few hundred to close to 2,000 organisms, and randomize them and take the top 10 or top 20 or top 50, a random sampling out of that much larger data set for which we knew the real percent susceptibility, and see what kind of average error he got over 50 iterations for all of these different combinations. So that was a medical student, Christian Tran, from here at Jefferson. We also had an undergraduate student, John Harvey, that worked with us on the mathematical modeling side of this to use the binomial function to predict what we should have observed randomly. So this is the mean error of these 50 iterations. And so you can see that when you're using some of this, see if this laser works. So when you're reporting things at only 10 to 20 isolates, you should expect anywhere from a 7 to 12% error on average every year for that data that you're reporting. We also recorded, in addition to the mean error, the maximum error observed. So out of the 50 iterations, what was the largest error that we observed compared to the real data? And you can also notice the mean error and the maximum error both were much higher when the real percent susceptibility was as close to 50 as possible. Just has more ability to vary within that range. But you can see that the maximum error is at 10, 20, and even 30. Observed in 50 iterations, which you might see over a reasonable period of time in reporting your own cumulative antibiogram, are quite large. I mean, you should expect these levels of errors when you use those numbers of isolates. And then this is just showing using the binomial function to predict the number of events that would be expected with the number of observations and a known rate of positivity. Just confirming that our randomization really did make sense with what would have been predicted for that function. One of the implications of that, one of the solutions for that is if you have a low number of isolates for something that your physicians really do want to know the local data for, is to use more than 1 year of data. Some labs do that, some don't. We've started to do more of that after we initiated this study. So one thing we could do with the randomized data that we couldn't do with the binomial function is to compare year over year change. And we did this for 2 separate sets of years. So comparing, I think it was 2018 to 2019, 2019 to 2020, and seeing how much could we reduce the error if instead of taking 10 isolates from year X, if we took 10 from year X and 10 from year X plus 1. And you can see that for 10, 30, and even 50 isolates, we had a significant reduction in the average error by combining the 2 years. Which suggests that the majority of the change observed in the statistics was due to sampling rather than a biological change in the organism. So we have started to do more of that too. And I don't know if you noticed in our antibiogram, we had a bunch of asterisks for organisms that were less than 50. We combined 2 years so we could get more data. We also used the binomial function to predict how many isolates would be needed to average a 5% error, to expect that you would only have a 5% error or less. And it is not the recommended 30 isolates. For a true percent susceptibility anywhere from 15 to 85, you can see that it was higher than 30 isolates, and in the middle up to 60 isolates. So we have started to make that change in our lab to try to, when we don't get at least 50 to 60 isolates, combine 2 years to raise the number of isolates in the data. We had a poster on this at the ASM meeting in Washington, D.C. this year to try to make the point. It's very common. About 80% of labs produce their antibiograms with low numbers, and it's really not helping anyone. And labs really get a lot of pressure to do this. For example, they'll do clinical work for nursing home, or they get a request from a specific subpopulation or their ICUs within the hospital. But if the data is not there, the data is not there, and it's just not accurate to report it. All right, so I want to talk about, let me see, how am I doing on time? So targeted treatment based on laboratory antimicrobial susceptibility testing. So how do we do testing in the laboratory? Not everybody here is from the clinical lab. So the gold standard for bacterial AST, and you saw this is a global standard thanks to Jim. So doing broth microdilution, typically in a 96-well plate with tighter concentration of antibiotics, and looking for which wells you see inhibition of growth. So that's the gold standard. Labs also do a lot of automated commercial systems. It's just easier to get a lot of results this way, less technologist time than doing the broth microdilution method. And so in this case, the organism is loaded into these commercial cassettes, which have a bunch of different concentrations of various antibiotics in them. And it's run on an automated system. There's 3, 4 primary brands that are available these, and generates a result like this. So this was an E. coli with an extended spectrum beta lactamase that we had a year ago or so in the lab that I have in some of my teaching slides. Anyway, so you get results for a lot of different antimicrobials all at once. You don't necessarily report them all, report them in cascades depending on what the resistance profile is. But you can get a lot of results very quickly. Jim had done a lot of work in standardizing disk diffusion testing, as you heard. This is a very common method in the laboratories, and it's, I think, starting to come back more into favor. There's been a lot of shift towards the commercial assays. Disk diffusion is cheaper. Disk diffusion also allows you to implement changes in the interpretive criteria from CLSI more rapidly. The commercial systems are FDA cleared, and to make changes to your interpretation, you have to actually go through a validation process, and it has to go through the FDA for you not to do a full, complete validation. So disk diffusion is coming back. There also are now new CLSI interpretive criteria to do disk diffusion off of direct from positive blood culture bottles. There were many labs that did this in the past, but now CLSI has endorsed it and actually has interpretive criteria specific to that application. There's also gradient diffusion. I'm not going to spend as much time on these next few, but gradient diffusion is sort of in between. So you get a strip of paper that has the drug spotted at different concentrations all along the strip, placed on agar, and then you can read a mean inhibitory concentration. It's kind of a combination of the previous two discussed methods. Genotypic testing has been increasing recently, which is not to do a phenotypic, like actually evaluating the organism to see if it's resistant to the drug per se, but evaluating with a molecular method like PCR to see if a particular resistance mechanism, a gene that encodes for a protein that causes resistance to particular antimicrobials is present. And so as an example, MEK-A, the presence of which converts Staph aureus to MRSA. So I'm sure you've heard of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. So there are PCR assays available to detect MRSA, combination of MEK-A positivity and Staph aureus detected. So the approach is very fast, but it can't replace susceptibility testing entirely because you wouldn't be able to detect any new mechanisms of resistance. And for some of the targets like ESBL, there are hundreds of different enzymes that can cause that resistance phenotype. There are also, for some of the resistance mechanisms, the entity that's producing the resistance is actually an enzyme, so you can detect it with an enzymatic assay, but I'm not going to spend much time talking about that. So I did want to get into at least one research paper. This was recently published about, I think, 6 months ago or so. On resistance-guided treatment to gonorrhea. So how do we treat gonorrhea? Can we have a lab test that can tell us if it's ciprofloxacin resistant or not specifically? So this is showing the rate of gonorrhea infection and that it's been going up over the last 10 years. So gonorrhea is the second most common cause of bacterial STD, and you can see that in the majority of the country, although sparing upper New England, the rate of gonorrhea has really increased significantly. At the same time, the rate of resistance to the agent that was previously recommended by the CDC, ciprofloxacin, has also been increasing. So not only an increase in the number of cases, an increase in the percentage of them that are resistant to what was the frontline therapy of ciprofloxacin. So this data also from the CDC shows their evaluation of a bunch of isolates of gonorrhea. And without going over each of the antimicrobials, you can see that the resistance rate to ciprofloxacin, the number of isolates or percentage of isolates resistant to ciprofloxacin is close to between 40 and 50%. So very high, which caused the CDC to change their recommendation a number of years ago to ceftriaxone instead of ciprofloxacin, which has implications for antimicrobial stewardship, and that you may then lead to a loss of the ability to use ceftriaxone over time for this organism, and see increased resistance in other organisms because of the increased use of ceftriaxone. So this research paper wanted to see, can we make a diagnostic test to identify if it's ciprofloxacin susceptible or not upfront at the time of diagnosis? And this was based on a lot of work from basic science laboratories all the way back into the 90s that had identified the resistance mechanism that was caused by point mutations in gyrase A and the PAR-C subunit of topoisomerase 4, primarily being driven by a single point mutation in DNA gyrase. And so this is another publication just a few years after that previous one, just showing that that particular mutation correlated with the in vitro susceptibility testing in the laboratory, such that that point mutation really could predict resistance to ciprofloxacin. But it took a very long time to get to the clinic. There have been a number of clinical studies over time, but this really was the first one to test it as we use this diagnostic test to detect that point mutation, predict cipro resistance, and then actually use ciprofloxacin. And they based it on an assay that was a PCR combined with fluorescence, resonance, energy transfer, FRET. And I'll show you where in the gene these targets go for those of you that are interested in that kind of thing. This is a chunk of DNA gyrase. The primers in blue actually would work for any Neisseria isolate, not just gonorrhea. And then the FRET probes in green and in red. The red FRET probe overlapped this single point mutation such that the overlap of that point mutation could be utilized in their assay to detect whether they had wild type gyrase or they mutated gyrase. A single change from a phenylalanine to a serine based on a single nucleotide change. So they could take advantage of the fact that that single nucleotide change changed the melt temperature. The temperature at which that probe would release from the amplicon was changed so that they could detect based on the melt curve after PCR whether they had a wild type gyrase or whether they had a mutated gyrase. And they used this assay to then, so they had patients that came into the clinic, had both a PCR, which is the gold standard test for gonorrhea now. Part of the reason you wouldn't just culture everybody and base it on the in vitro susceptibility, phenotypic susceptibility. Almost all of it is PCR combined for gonorrhea and chlamydia. So they had all of these patients and they had a routine PCR, they had cultures, but they also ran them on this assay, which could both detect the organism and determine if it had wild type or mutated DNA gyrase. And then if they had wild type DNA gyrase, they were treated with a single dose of ciprofloxacin and sent back, I think in 7 days or 10 days, even though that's not the CDC recommended therapy, but they were able to get approval and enroll them in this clinical trial. So they kept track of the data in 3 groups. So they had all enrollees, including non-wild type gyrase, all enrollees who were treated with ciprofloxacin. In this case, they still had some failures, but they counted as failures anyone who did not show up for the follow-up testing, which actually all 8 of their failures were not people who showed up and weren't cured. They were people who didn't come back at 10 days later for testing. So they still count those as a failure. But for all 117 of the patients who were detected at the beginning to have wild type gyrase and were treated with a single dose of ciprofloxacin and came back 10 days later for their testing, 100% of them had microbiologic cure, no detection of the gonorrhea. So they can use this diagnostic approach to be able to tell what kind of organism they have up front and to guide their therapy based on that detection and 100% success rate in this case. So this is my last slide. So just a summary. So how do we know how to treat an infection? And the simple thing is it's a work in progress. So it's not set in stone. It's continuous work for ID physicians and ID pharmacists, clinical lab partners to update these guidelines, like the example we had for the Lyme disease. They have guidelines for almost everything. Based on new clinical trial data, there's new drugs coming out all the time, so these recommendations have to be updated. It's also continuous work for clinical labs to implement the most accurate testing methods and to provide accurate results for patient care, but also, as we noted, for accurate cumulative data like antibiograms, that not only are used by clinicians making empiric decisions, but are also used by institutions to set their own guidelines for how to treat infections at their hospital. It's also continuous work for basic science labs to elucidate emerging mechanisms of resistance, like we saw in the case of Neisseria gonorrhea, gyrase, DNA gyrase, and how that could be used as a diagnostic test that would predict their susceptibility to ciprofloxacin. So continuous work for elucidating those mechanisms, but also partnering as research labs, industry, and clinical labs to bring those into the clinic as quickly as we can so that we can help patients in that way. And that is it. I think I finished on time. So.
Thank you so much. Don't go anywhere. Thank you so much, Matt.
Yep.
I think we have time for a question, if there is any questions. Yes, Vincent?
Thank you. I'm not like bodies. So in my mind, high assumption size is always better. And so why restrict the data within the institution body society instead of pulling from multiple regions of the institution and pull from multiple years? Because I feel like the years might be misinterpreted because with a single mutation you can have
Yeah. Yeah, I think for some organisms, it would be better to combine multiple institutions within the same region. I'm not aware of any examples of that, other than that some states actually do produce antibiograms of all of the data from a single state. There are some that do that. I know New York does that, New Hampshire does that. For some of the organisms, it really is institution specific, particularly for some organisms that can either be totally susceptible at one institution, like so Acinetobacter baumannii as an example, where you can really have a hospital that's got very high rates of resistance, and 50 miles away you've got another hospital that has none. They are very low. So for some of the organisms, it really is down to the institution, because you can have a lot of nosocomial spread of an organism where you have a resistance phenotype that is spreading from patient to patient within a hospital population. Over time, that may get through the region, but at a single point in time, it really may be institution specific. For other organisms, it really probably would be better to pool it regionally and make that data available. One of the things that's recommended by CLSI, though, is to not pool data that's not by the same methodology, right? So then you run into the problem of, well, you know, we're doing it on a commercial assay called the BD Phoenix. It may be that Ben is doing disk diffusion, and maybe Alan is doing the Vitek. And so it's probably okay to combine those, but when you're using different methods, you have to be a little bit careful with that. Probably most organisms it wouldn't matter, but I agree there ought to be more regional participation, especially for the organisms that you have few isolates of.
Great. One more question.
Yeah, so how often do you look at your AST or antibiogram and then make recommendations to your healthcare institution based on the selection of antibiotics that they use for, say, treatment or prophylactic-based treatment for surgeries and things like that?
So we do it annually. This recommendation is to have one at least annually. I know some places do it every 6 months. But every year that we generate them, before we actually release the results, we meet with our antimicrobial stewardship team and ID physicians just to see that it sort of makes sense. Is there any change in what they want to report? We've done a lot of structural changes. You saw our example is sort of the red light, yellow light, green light. That was a change last year that we talked about with them. So we do that annually. And also they were involved in this modeling research study. And I can tell you that that information about how much error you should expect on low isolates changed their thinking about our antibiogram data. One way that it did is that they'll make a lot of changes to try to, sort of restrict the use of one agent or, encourage using another one. And they have interpreted in the past when they'll see a change like from year to year, like, oh, well, the resistance went down 12%. What we did worked. And now he's kind of the impression like, well, we don't have any idea if it worked until we see it for multiple years in a row, because that may just be noise in the data. So discussing that project with them, I think, was impactful on how they use our antibiogram data in their own institutional guidelines.
Sorry, to follow up, how much molecular data do you add into those decisions?
None. This is all phenotypic susceptibility testing data.
So don't go anywhere. So thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Dr. Pettengill. It was a great talk. And I want to thank you for being our keynote speaker for the James A. Poupard Memorial Lecture. And we have a token, a little plaque here that that we want to give you that says James A. Poupard, PhD, Memorial Lecture, Eastern Pennsylvania branch of the American Society for Microbiology, keynote speaker, Matthew Pettengill, PhD, with the date and Thomas Jefferson University. So. And I also would like to give one to the, we also as a branch have one for the Poupard family.
They want to see you on Zoom. Your public is clamoring.
I guess we have to stand back here. Okay, so I'm not sure if the Zoom is working, but so again, this is for Barbara Poupard and in commemoration of this evening and just your wonderful family. And we thank you for being here, and we really commemorate what a wonderful person Jim is and what a wonderful person you are. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, I think that's it. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thanks to the committee for all your hard work, and really, this was a great evening, and thanks again. Bye, everyone.